Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to wherever you're tuning in from around the world. I figured I'd drop this episode in before we go any further in understanding tarot, specifically because it was asked to me the other day by somebody who's learning tarot. And one of the things that came up is, which deck to use. And a lot of times you'll hear, choose whichever deck you're attracted to. And to a point, that's kind of true. But it can also lead to a lot of problems. And I'm about to explain why. So we're going to jump around here a bit, but I promise you that it's all connected. It's all connected, bro. It's all connected, and my madness will make sense at the end. Most everybody's familiar with the Rider-Waite deck, or what I like to prefer to call the Waite-Smith deck. However, there are many decks out there. And this was my first deck here. This is called the Enchanted Tarot. It was something that was given to me, as is the custom generally. You're given a deck. And I'll be honest, when I was younger, I had a heck of a time trying to understand it. Now, after 30 years of reading tarot, I don't use this because it's still difficult to understand. And the reason it's difficult to understand is because it's its own system. The trouble comes when you go to do a spread, and if you're not familiar with the deck itself, what you end up doing is you end up looking up the meaning of the cards. And if you aren't looking up the meaning of the cards according to the system that the cards are using, then you could be entirely misled. So, for instance, I generally point to two websites, Biddy Tarot, she's awesome. I can't remember her name right now, Laura or something like that. But Biddy Tarot is awesome. That's generally a Waite-Smith style deck. The other one is Labyrinthos, which is generally along the Waite-Smith explanations as well. So what do I mean by systems? And by systems, let me kind of take you through a little bit of a history, and then I'll compare a few systems really quickly. I'll try not to geek out too much for y'all. Okay. But if we look into the history of things, tarot cards, they can be traced back to Italy, to the 1400s in Italy, where they were first called trionfi and then later called tarocchi. And the important thing about tarocchi back then is most of the trump cards, there were 16 Roman or Greek gods presented. So all the things we're familiar with: Neptune, Bacchus, Mercury, Mars, Hercules, all that jazz, which doesn't sound anything like what we read today. Again, a completely different system. Out of that came the Tarot de Marseille. It was tarocchi adopted by the French after they co-opted it from Italy, and that was in the late 1400s. Now we have to fast forward several hundred years to 1781, where we have a gentleman named Antoine Court de Gebelin. He was a Protestant pastor. Basically, he was kind of taken by the number of people in Paris that were reading tarot at that time. And it was generally amongst the aristocracy. They thought it was quite fun. He ends up writing an essay in a book, and the essay is called The Primeval World, Analyzed and Compared to the Modern World. Ugh, that's one heck of a title. But basically what he ends up doing is he ends up trying to tie the tarot with Egyptian mythology, specifically the Book of Thoth. Now, this is important because this is 120, 150 years before Crowley. So the thing is, everybody's Crowley crazy these days. And I'm telling you right now that Crowley pretty much, like everybody else, co-opted or outright, if not outright, ripped off a great many things and called it his own. So yeah, de Gebelin writes this long essay in 1781, and the problem was he didn't present any evidence that there was a link between tarot and the Book of Thoth, or the Book of Thoth. Depends on how you want to pronounce it. That's up for debate. There was later another essay by another author named de Mêlée that's responsible for the connection between the 21 trumps of the tarot and the Hebrew alphabet. And it was from this that we probably get the first true system. So, or better yet, the first true methodology 2 years later from a gentleman who called himself Attila. So Jean-Baptiste Aliette, or AKA Attila. And he was rather ingenious. Again, he ends up becoming very famous throughout France for being the first true practitioner. And he creates his own deck called the Livre de Thoth, 1789. And from that, we get a full system. Here we have the Table of Blades of Thoth, which I'm still kind of really getting into. It's interesting, but I'm not sure how much depth there is to it, because I'm kind of trying to figure out what his research was in creating this. I haven't found yet a true grimoire by him about this, explaining how he came up with this table. But this is the result of his stuff. Now we fast forward from 1783 to the early 1900s, 1909. We get Pamela Colman Smith, the illustrator, along with A.E. Waite, the, how would we describe him? He was a studious writer for esotericism. He wasn't very, he was scholarly, but he wasn't well trained. So a lot of times he would write books or essays and he would roast other authors, which is kind of odd. But through that we get 1909, we get the Waite Smith deck, finally. And again, when you're doing this, when you're looking at systems, you have to know kind of where they come from. At this point in history, kind of between the 1880s through almost 1915-ish, British Egyptology was kind of at its golden age. And the reason this came about is basically because the British Empire occupied Egypt in 1882. And, the way people used to think back then was to the victor go the spoils. It wasn't until about 1956 when the Brits finally kind of cleared out of there. So there's a lot of time. And through that, of course, you get, unfortunately, people, depends on the word you want to use, raided or, researched ancient Egyptian culture. And that came to Europe. There's always been, throughout the history of Europe, a fascination with Egypt, but it kind of reached fever pitch when the Brits were occupying Egypt. It was never a colony, don't get me wrong there. They just occupied it. And so, why that's important, out of all this, A.E. Waite wrote many things about Hermeticism and the Kabbalah. So, for instance, he wrote a text to accompany the deck called The Key of the Tarot in 1911. And then he also wrote something called the Book of Ceremonial Magic, which you can still get on Amazon, in the same year, 1911. And then later on, he wrote the Holy Kabbalah in 1929. He was also pretty heavily involved with the Golden Dawn. This is where we get the Crowley connection and heavier Kabbalistic influences. The Golden Dawn had been going for quite a few years, since the late 1800s. But again, reaching fever pitch, and they started tying in quite a few things between Thoth, Egyptology, and later on divination, so aka the tarot cards. Okay, so the reason that I wanted to go through that really quickly is mainly because the Waite Smith deck is by far still the most popular tarot deck in the world. And like I mentioned a few minutes ago, if you're learning tarot and you look up an explanation on the net, you're pretty much going to have something aligned with the Waite Smith deck. But here's where we kind of get into trouble, because if you gravitate towards a different sort of deck, you have to really either get the companion text with it, if they wrote one at all, something that goes beyond the little white book that comes in the box, or you have to spend a lot of time pathworking and interviewing the deck to better understand what it means. So let's kind of talk about the symbology here for a second so you can understand what I mean. So here we have just a really basic example in the Waite-Smith deck, the Fool, the Hermit, and the Moon. And obviously the Fool being God's eminence, we're all foolish when we're born. We're thrown into God's will to being in this life, whether we want to or not. And you see the person carefree at the mountaintop, maybe about to fall off the cliff. But what's important here in the symbology is you look at the mountaintops between all three cards. So right now the Fool's not paying attention and he's on top of a mountaintop, and behind him you can see snow-capped mountains. You go over to the Hermit card and he's basically standing on those snow-capped mountains that are in the background of the Fool. So the Fool and the Hermit are connected in a way where the Fool has no self-reflection, is not taking time out to think about anything. The Hermit is definitely, after his trials and tribulations, taking some time out to self-reflect. And then again, there's a connection between the Hermit and the Moon. So the Hermit, he's bowing down, looking down towards the ground to see what that is that's symbolically talking about awareness. So being completely aware that he's on the mountaintops, being completely aware of his situation. And he's lifting the lamp, you might have heard of this, lifting the lamp to light the way. And the lamp represents his intuition. If you look at the Moon card, the face of the moon inside, or excuse me, the face on the moon is a reflection of the Hermit's face, specifically to remind the reader. And beneath the moon, you can see the mountains in the far distance now. So it's a reflection of the Hermit's time in self-reflection and his intuition. So that's why the moon is the card of intuition, illusion, understanding not to get carried away while also listening to your inner voice. It's a complex card. Now, if we compare that to something else, such as the Mystic Tarot by Tricia Newell, 1986, getting very difficult to find these days, getting pretty expensive. Happen to have had it for a number of years now. This deck, which I quite like, we have some similarities. Here we have the same thing, the Fool, not paying attention to where he's going, about to fall off the mountaintop. And then, again, the Hermit. There's some slight similarities. You see the hilltops in the background this time. Instead of seeing him being on the mountaintop, you see the hills in the background. He's still lifting the lamp. And then from the Hermit to the Moon in this one, it's kind of, the face of the moon is a nod, I guess, to Waite-Smith, because they're almost using the same bowing down of the Hermit's face in the face of the moon. Even though the Hermit in this deck is not looking down, he's not really, the Hermit card doesn't really have that full symbology of self-awareness, looking down to see where he's at. Instead, he's kind of like staring straight at you kind of thing. And on top of that, he has a scythe and I'm not sure if that's a raven, a rook, or a crow, or a starling on his shoulder. And the bird on his shoulder, as well as the scythe, is the awareness. That is the awareness that life is finite, that time is always passing. Instead of situational awareness of where you're at, there's an awareness of life is passing you by, and to reflect on the things that you want. So we have some nods to Smith-Coleman, to Waite-Smith. It's not exactly the same, so you have to be a little bit more careful. And then if we go over here to this deck, this is again the first one that I ever had. This is called the Enchanted Tarot. And so we got the Fool, the Hermit, and the Moon, and I'll be honest, they got nothing to do with each other, which is probably why I had so much difficulty those years ago learning from this deck. There's almost no connection visually between the Fool and the Hermit. There's kind of a connection between the Hermit and the Moon. Maybe if you're reaching by looking at the shape of the crescent path that the Hermit's on, it's almost like a crescent moon. That's about all I can find. I mean, you have these called feathered fans kind of at the top, but you see that throughout much of the deck, so it doesn't equate. And the entire deck also is meant to look like knitted embroidery patterns. So that's just the style of the deck. It has nothing to do with the connection between these cards. The whole deck looks like that. So this would be very, very difficult to learn from. So all the other decks that are out there these days, and there's hundreds if not thousands of them, you have to be very careful. Do they equate to what you're going to use to look up anything, or are you going to stick within the system? And then, even then, is their system well known enough? Is there enough resources for that system to teach you? There is something to be said about intuition, but a lot of times, like, I'll kind of drop in on a reader, like at a, oh God, what do you call it? Reading fair, psychic fair, those kind of things. And man, lovely people, but they're just a lot of times trying way too hard. I'm not saying that's everybody at a reading fair. It's just a lot of times they don't seem so self-assured, and they get far too many of the cards on the nose. So if you're learning tarot, the really important thing is to learn the system and know what system the cards are trying to teach you, because each card deck is trying to teach you something. So if we compare all three right next to each other, what we have so we have the Waite Smith on the far left, then we have Trisha Newell's here in the center, and Enchanted Tarot on the far right, all meaning completely different things. You'd think the Lover's card would be the exact same thing. No, not exactly. So if we look closely at the Waite Smith, what we have is the man on the lower right. He is completely entranced or transfixed by the female. And if you notice the female now, she's completely transfixed by the angel up in the air. Behind the man is a burning bush. Essentially, it almost looks the same as the tree with the apples behind the female, but that's a burning bush representing his passion for the relationship. And the female looking up towards the angel, it represents her, the divine female, the divinity of women. Absolutely. And their connection between this plane and the next. And the angel up in the air, that is Raphael. And basically what this card is representing is the struggle or the trade-offs between the physical and emotional well-being of yourself and within a relationship. The angels are obviously up in the air. Air is linked to thinking and talking, which is crucial to any relationship. So what this card is talking about is kind of the struggle of what you bring to the table, what you need and want from it, what she needs and wants from it. And it doesn't necessarily, again, have to be too on the nose about a romantic relationship. It's any relationship you have. Then we go to the middle one, Trisha Newell's. This is very different. You may not know, this card represents what is called the Judgment of Paris. And what it is the Judgment of Paris is a story out of Greek mythology in which Eris, who is the goddess of discord, gives Paris a golden apple. And you'll notice he's holding an apple in his left hand there. And the apple is inscribed, though not in the picture, but in the Greek myth. The apple's inscribed with the words, "To the fairest." And Paris has three women in front of them, and those three women are Hera, Aphrodite, and Athena. And basically, his job is to kind of pick who he wants. But what Paris ends up doing is he trades his app to Aphrodite, who's standing there in the center. Maybe you've seen statues of her. Sometimes she's also represented, she often represents love. Paris ends up trading the apple to Aphrodite in exchange for the love of Helen, as in Helen of Troy, the most beautiful woman in the world. And of course, as we all know, history books show, Troy ends up falling. So that's the Judgment of Paris. But what the card means, each goddess or woman in that card there embodies a gift. So on the left we have Hera, who's power and wealth. Aphrodite, who's of course love and sex and passion and all that jazz. And Athena on the right, the goddess of Athens, who's all about wisdom and bravery. So when this card shows up in this system, it's telling you have to make a choice based on what you value most and be prepared to accept the consequences. So kind of like the struggle between what, Waite Smith here, and kind of like the struggle of, finding a balance between what you want and what they want in a relationship. This is more about consequences and being forced into a choice. And then finally, the third system here, we have the Enchanted Tarot. Man, and I tell you, this one's just, yeah. Again, I kind of like it from an aesthetic point of view. I only keep it around for a sentimental reason, but it is awfully tough to read because while they created their own system and they have a pretty good book, it doesn't really equate to much else other than itself. So unless this really speaks to you and you really get to know it, it's a tough system to know. But basically what it's talking about when this card shows up, there's no real mythology behind this card. That's one. Whereas Waite Smith, we have quite a biblical thing going on. In the middle, we have a literal depiction of a Greek myth going on. Here we have just no history whatsoever. Nothing to base it on. It's completely esoteric. And what this card basically means is, according to their system, your relationships reflect your own inner balance. So it's pretty straightforward, really. Make sure that what is attracting you away from who, what, and where you are now is not a reflection of your dissatisfaction you feel with yourself. It's quite deep, really, and quite, I would say, much more psychological than the other two. Nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with that at all. But you have to know, again, the system that you're using. So if you were using the Enchanted Tarot, you pull the cards and you're like, oh, what do the cards mean? And you end up going over to Biddy or Labyrinthos or any other of the popular ones, just doing a Google. It's not gonna mean anything, unfortunately, because each deck is created with its own intention, and you have to understand the intention that the creator had, the creator of the deck. My recommendation is find something that has a lot of resources. It doesn't have to be Waite Smith at all. I have a student who just cannot connect to Waite Smith, and that's perfectly fine. But just make sure that you fully understand what the meaning of the cards within that system is all about. Spirit, the universe will be speaking to you through that lens, so you have to understand where the energy is coming from, what lens the energy is coming through. So find a system that has a lot of resources to it. Find a system where you can talk to others who also use it so they can provide guidance for you. Because I would almost say, when you get too far away from stuff, so for instance, if we go back to Enchanted Tarot here for a second, seeing that there's no connection between the cards, they're almost not tarot to begin with. They're almost more oracle cards at this point. Because tarot traditionally, if we look through the historical records, they've always been either attached to Egyptology, attached to somewhat of a biblical sense, or Kabbalah specifically. So that's Waite Smith. So Jewish Kabbalah, which again comes from Egyptology way back, and Hermeticism. So anytime you kind of get one of them new funky decks, just keep in mind if you're doing something more than collecting, if you're trying to be a practitioner, then get to know it really, really well and understand where the deck's coming from. So I hope this helped. I hope this maybe guided you towards a few more things to help you along your way, whether you're reading for yourself or reading for others. And if you have any questions, drop a comment below or contact me either through Reddit at Taoist360 or at the website tarotpathwork.com. Until next time.